And if we're going to compete with these global economies, since, for instance, the American auto industry stretches from Toronto all the way down to Torreon in Mexico, having one currency would greatly stabilize a multi-billion-dollar industry. And I don't know how real the Amero is. I've seen it on national news. I've seen pictures of it. I see it on the internet. I've never held one in my hands, but if that were to happen...
Yes, there's some credible discussion of it. The Amero was long time discussed in the mid-'90s, was the first introduction of the idea. It goes into the late 90s where it started losing its popularity. We started hearing about it in just about 2003, 2004, when it was starting to break onto the public sphere. I heard that, and this is from sources I trust very much. I have a few friends that have a lot of wealth. The interest at this point is something that probably won't be so much an Amero so much as they might even go much larger of a currency. I've heard discussion is popular among some of these elite think tanks that they're trying to push a larger trading currency, maybe backed by the World Bank. And that's actually now that also is not as popular as the Amero, but it is being discussed. Something like that would also stabilize the markets on a scale we've never seen. But also, that would also skip a few steps. Maybe they could do that. Maybe they could suddenly do that. I mean, the markets are so interdependent right now, and you have so many countries that, let's face it, it's the upper class elite private sector, which are the government in every capitalist society right now. And they're pretty much all deciding everything, and they're all pretty much on the same page. They're just trying to figure out how to go to the people and sell them policies. That's what a politician is. Their job is to go to the people and sell them the policies they have to write for the rich people. Which is that's just the reality. You know what I mean?
I wonder how even necessary. I wonder how even necessary it is anymore. I mean, we look at what's going on in this country. We have virtually no one that's in support of what the administration is doing, and yet they're pouring ahead full speed, manipulating the press by keeping them out of key meetings, producing documents that are several hundred pages, even 1,000 pages long, not giving anyone on the committee time to read it. Go ahead and vote yes, and we'll solve it later. You know how it's done here in Washington. It's clear that somebody is making this policy, and I guess my question is, which we never talk about on this program, but we're going to tonight, who's making this global policy? Who's putting all this together? You talk about the wealthy. Most of the wealthy I know are in competition with one another. They're not cooperating with each other.
It's kind of like mafias. You've got a game that they all share. Okay, they all share in their cartels, but they're competing for power constantly. Their territories are being debated over who's controlling. There's interfighting. That's just how it is. But if anything comes together and threatens that mafia, they will band together and secure their interests. That's kind of what you have with policy in government, is you have different lobbyist groups, large corporate interests, and then you have think tanks. These are the three categories. Now, your lobbyists generally don't bother with pushing anything. They generally just buy a politician, campaign him into office, and then hand off the legislation and tell him who to pardon. And it's usually small like that. That's usually the history of lobbyists. When it comes to think tanks usually campaign for very powerful people like the president. And then when the president gets in, they usually make suggestions on who to be in which cabinets, which tend to be their own members. Now, these people usually have policies written and pre-approved and debated by different think tanks. So the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, for example, are very influential in helping advise the government. Now, they're unelected bodies, but there's nothing illegal about advising. However, it is still treasonous. I mean, it is a very gray zone area. They're unelected officials. There is direct evidence that they've actually handed not just a suggestion, but actual policy off. A lot of people think the president is kind of like the decision maker in the office. It's actually more like the president goes in and he gets advised by these other cabinet members who he had to put in by suggestions of people who made his campaign. So the cabinet makes more decisions, if anything. They're the ones really writing the policy. It's more complicated than people give it credit for. And they usually have the policy and go to the president and say, here's what the policy is. I need your signature. go ahead and put your John Hancock and let's check this through. And that policy is usually heavily influenced by the think tank, not anyone else. So it's the way they bypass the people is very clever. And that's really how you deal with it. I mean, and the other thing is you have to remember, it's very common for like the CEO of Monsanto to become the head of the Department of Agriculture. It's very common for defense contractors to become Secretary of State or Defense Secretary. There's this theme in the cabinet where not only are they tend to be members of the same think tanks, they also tend to fill the positions that benefit their own interests. It's a revolving door where they kind of lock arms and dance to their loo, and they just, there's no difference between big corporations and big government. They're kind of the same thing when you talk about that level of politics. When you're talking about local and state, no, not really. Not really. Their focus on local and state is more voting and the election process and making sure certain people remain in the Congress. That's about it, and senators. But when it goes to the federal level, their control is more so in the cabinets. So that's kind of how it works. And then you have your different corporate interests. The banking cartels, clearly behind this bailout. Remember during the oil cartels, remember when oil was skyrocketing, we were paying ridiculous amounts for gas, and oil companies were reporting record profits.
Oh, sure.
And what are we seeing right now with the bailout banks? Record profits for companies that were bailed out. Now, it's kind of the same thing. So in that case, what you have is an obvious sign of these cartels making a move for their own interests. And that's kind of how it works. They unless they're really competing against each other directly, they just kind of let each other in once in a while at the trough, turn on the faucet, and feed themselves.
Well,
and they kind of have this little game.
I see this.
One of their oldest tricks is using the Republican-Democratic paradigm, the right-left paradigm, against the people. Very old strategy.
Right.
Divide and conquer.
Right.
People
right.
play that a lot.
I mean, well, we see this on a national level. Like even in our industry, in the automotive industry, we see a Secretary Chu of the DOE, and we hear him come out publicly and say he's going to do a lot for electric cars, and we hear Obama say, oh yes, electric vehicles, we'll support battery companies and electric vehicles, and we're going to help small business and innovation, and nothing, absolutely nothing even close to that actually happened. And Secretary Chu, making his reports this last week, was asked repeatedly, what are you going to do about electric vehicles? I mean, there's no electric vehicles. No money is going to electric vehicle companies. When are you going to start helping them? And he's, kind of passed it off and said, well, it's more complicated than it looks, and, we can't really do that. And what he's effectively saying is, look, we're in the car business now, all right? So we can't make electric cars because if we do, we're going to hurt our car company. So, that's what it boils down to. But this is on a national level. When we go to Washington, and we often do go to D.C., we talk to our senator, our congressman, and different committees and administrations. Nothing gets done on a federal level. They always send you back to the state. Go back to the state. They're the ones that have the money. They have the programs. They have the ground level stuff. So you come back to the state, and they say, well, the federal government hasn't given us any money to do this, and we'd have to tax our own people, and we can't do that. We'd rather tax people in other states. And that's how they have to go back to the federal government. So it's a big circle, but this is all national stuff. I'm talking about global policy. On the surface, in the news, it looks like the United States is competing with the rest of the world, with Russia, with China, with Japan, with Germany, with the oil cartels. But that's not actually what we see on a very high level. We see profiteering on an unbelievable scale, not just in money, but in resources and human capital.
Right. If I had to take my guess, I would, and this is an educated guess, I would go on the global scale and say that, first of all, post Cold War, you have a War Department. There's always operations. The interest of the military is to maintain security for the nation and increase our influence over the sphere we call the Earth. Those operations continued post-World War II. We called it the Cold War. Now, when the Cold War ended, intelligence agencies didn't just disappear. The Pentagon wasn't shut down. It all still existed. It just changed tactics, had to look for new enemies, continue expanding its influence.
Sure.
So that plays a factor when you're talking about, for example, the KGB history over in Russia. Look at the whole story about Litvinek. I can't remember his name. The Russian that was poisoned, the journalist, ex-KGB agent who turned whistleblower. He was exposing Vladimir Putin's rise to power from Berezovsky, and saying that that they used false flag terrorism to bring him to power. And he was immediately considered a threat to everyone, so he was brought over to England. And the one man who killed him, Lugovoy, who probably did kill him, let's face it, the radiation was found in all three places Lugovoy was in, he won't even confess to it. We know it was him. Now what does that tell you? It tells you something about the old KGB has been completely